Every story has a beginning. Movies begin with a first scene. Books begin with a first sentence. Our own lives begin with a first breath. And the Bible, the most influential book in human history, begins with these famous words: "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." You've probably heard that 100 times, maybe 1,000. It's been read in churches, quoted in classrooms, painted on posters, even used as an argument in debates about science and faith. Those words are so familiar that we rarely stop to question them. But what if I told you that the very first verse of the Bible, the foundation of all Scripture, has been mistranslated? Yes, you heard me correctly. The Bible you grew up with, the one you've trusted your whole life, may not actually say what you think it says in its opening line. Now I know that's a bold claim, but here's the truth. The original Hebrew text does not say, "in the beginning." That's an interpretation that came later, through translation choices, church tradition, and centuries of repetition. What the Hebrew actually says is far more interesting. It says, "When God began to create the heavens and the earth." Did you catch the difference? Not "in the beginning," as if pointing to a single moment in time, but "when God began to create," as if introducing an ongoing process, a story still unfolding. That small shift changes everything. Think about it. If you read it the traditional way, "in the beginning," then you picture a distant moment in the past, when God snapped his fingers and created everything out of nothing. A one-time event, long ago, sealed off from us. But if you read it the way the Hebrew actually says it, "when God began to create," suddenly creation isn't a past event. It's a process. It's God stepping into chaos, shaping it, ordering it, giving it meaning. And that process isn't locked in the past. It's something God is still doing today. That's the real power of this verse. But before we get too far ahead, let's pause for a moment. Why does this matter? Why spend 40 minutes on just one verse? Because words shape theology. Theology shapes faith, and faith shapes lives. If the first verse of the Bible has been mistranslated, then every doctrine built on it needs to be re-examined. Our understanding of creation, our view of God's nature, even the way we wrestle with science and faith, all of it connects back to how we read these opening words. And here's the shocking part. This mistranslation isn't new. Jewish scholars noticed it long before Christianity even existed. Rabbis in the Middle Ages pointed it out. Modern Hebrew experts still point it out today. But because tradition is powerful, most English Bibles have left it untouched. Tradition said, "in the beginning." The Hebrew said, "when God began." So here's what we're going to do together. For the next 40 minutes, we're going to dig beneath the surface. We're going to look at the Hebrew words themselves, explore what Jewish scholars and rabbis actually taught, compare with other ancient creation stories, and trace how translators turned one meaning into another. And then we're going to ask, what does this mean for us? What does it mean that God's creative work wasn't just in the past, but is happening even now? What does it mean for science, for theology, for our personal lives? By the end of this study, I promise you this: you will never read Genesis 1 the same way again. So grab your Bible, maybe even grab a notebook, and let's begin, not in the beginning, but when God began to create. Now that we've opened the door, let's go deeper into that very first word, Bereshit. Bereshit. If you were to open a Hebrew Bible, the first thing you'd see is this single word. For thousands of years, Jewish children learning Torah began their study right here, with Bereshit. So what does it mean? Most English Bibles say it means, "in the beginning." But that's not exactly what the Hebrew says. Let's break it down. The word Reshit by itself means beginning or first part. You see it used in verses like Proverbs 1:7, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning, Reshit, of knowledge." But in Genesis 1:1, it doesn't just say Reshit, it says Bereshit, with the prefix be attached. In Hebrew, be usually means in or at. So at first glance, you'd think it means in the beginning. But here's the catch. Bereshit is in what Hebrew grammar calls the construct state. That means it doesn't stand alone. It connects to what follows. It's like saying, at the beginning of, and then you have to finish the thought. For example, if I said, at the beginning of the race, and then stopped talking, you'd feel like something was missing. That's exactly what's happening in Genesis 1:1. Bereshit is incomplete unless you read it with verse 2. That's why many Hebrew scholars argue the verse should be read, when God began to create the heavens and the earth was formless and void. Not in the beginning, God created as a closed, standalone sentence, but when God began, leading into the description that follows. Now, this isn't a new idea. Jewish commentators noticed this over 1,000 years ago. Rabbi Rashi, one of the greatest medieval Jewish scholars, 11th century, explained that Genesis 1:1 isn't about the absolute first moment of creation. Instead, he wrote, "This verse says nothing about the order of creation. It simply says, at the beginning of God's creating the heavens and the earth was unformed and void." Do you see the difference? For Rashi, this isn't a story of God making matter from nothing. It's the story of God entering a scene already filled with chaos, darkness, and water, and beginning his work of ordering it. Ibn Ezra, another Jewish commentator from the 12th century, agreed. He pointed out that Bereshit isn't a complete phrase on its own. It only makes sense as the opening clause of a longer sentence. So why do most English Bibles still say, in the beginning? Because of tradition. Translators were following the Greek Septuagint, which rendered it as en arche, in the beginning. But the Hebrew grammar doesn't naturally support that reading. Now let me make this very practical. When you read in the beginning, you think of a point in time. A clock starts ticking, the beginning of everything. But when you read when God began to create, you think of a story. You imagine God stepping into a scene and starting his work. One version is static, past tense, finished. The other is dynamic, an unfolding process. And here's the real beauty. The Hebrew doesn't just care about when things happened. It cares about what things mean. Genesis 1 isn't answering the question, when did matter begin to exist? It's answering the question, what happens when God begins his work? That's why this matters. The word Bereshit doesn't just tell us about time. It tells us about God's action. It invites us into a story that begins with chaos but moves toward order, light, and life. So the very first word of the Bible sets the tone. Genesis isn't a science textbook. It's not a material timeline. It's the story of how God gives meaning to the universe. And all of that is hidden in that one Hebrew word, Bereshit. Now that we've broken open the first word, Bereshit, let's take a closer look at how Hebrew grammar works compared to English. This part is so important because if you only think in English, the phrase, in the beginning, God created, sounds perfectly fine, smooth, complete. But when you read it in Hebrew, it feels off. It's like a sentence missing its ending. Let me explain. In Hebrew, words often appear in different forms, depending on how they connect. Bereshit is one of those words. It's in what's called the construct state. That means it's not independent. It has to link to something else. Think of it like this. In English, if I said, at the start of, you would naturally wait for me to finish. At the start of what? At the start of the race? At the start of the story? That's the sense of Bereshit. So when translators in English render it as, in the beginning, a standalone phrase, they cut the sentence short. They turned an opening clause into a finished statement. That's why many modern Jewish translations don't follow the traditional Christian versions. For example, the Jewish Publication Society's Tanakh translates it, when God began to create heaven and earth, the earth being unformed and void, with darkness over the surface of the deep and a wind from God sweeping over the water. God said, "Let there be light." Notice how that flows. Verse 1 and verse 2 are not two separate events. They're one sentence, one flowing thought. Now let's step back and ask, why did English translators ignore the grammar? Part of it is tradition. Once the Greek Septuagint translated Bereshit as en arche, in the beginning, later translations like the Latin Vulgate and eventually the King James Bible simply followed the pattern. Tradition became stronger than grammar. But part of it also has to do with how languages think differently. English is comfortable with definite points in time. We like chronology, sequence, timestamps. In the beginning makes sense to us. Hebrew often prefers relational, flowing ideas. It's less about marking exact time and more about describing context. So Hebrew doesn't say, "Here's the first moment of history." Instead, it says, "Here's what it was like when God began his work." That shift is subtle but profound. Let me give you an example. In Hosea 1:2, it says, "Techilat dibber, YHWH Behoshea." Literally, at the beginning of YHWH, speaking through Hosea. Notice that same pattern, not a fixed point in time, but an introduction to an ongoing action. That's the same construction as Genesis 1:1. So when you see Bereshit, don't think of a timestamp. Think of a doorway. It's not about when something happened, but what happened when God began his action. Now here's why this matters theologically. If you read Genesis 1:1 as a standalone, in the beginning God created, you imagine a God who did his work once, long ago. But if you read it as Hebrew intends, when God began to create, you see a God who is in motion, active, shaping, and still creating. And that's not just grammar, it's worldview. One way sees God as distant, tied to a past event. The other sees God as present, continually involved in bringing order and meaning. So when people ask me, does Hebrew grammar really matter? My answer is simple, yes. Because grammar shapes theology, and theology shapes how we see God. And the tragedy is this. By ignoring Hebrew grammar, centuries of translators shifted our view of God from a living creator at work in the present to a distant creator who only worked in the past. That's why we have to return to the Hebrew. Because the Hebrew never stopped showing us a God who is still speaking, still creating, still bringing light out of darkness. Now that we've looked at verse 1 in detail, let's step into verse 2. Genesis 1:2 says, "And the earth was formless and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters." If you grew up reading this, you probably just skimmed over it. God created everything in verse 1, and then here in verse 2 we just get a description of the raw earth before God started shaping it. But here's the problem. If verse 1 was really about God creating matter out of nothing, why is there already an earth, already darkness, already deep waters before God begins speaking? This is where the mistranslation of verse 1 really shows itself, because if verse 1 actually means, when God began to create, then verse 2 makes perfect sense. It's telling us what things were like at the moment God began his work. Let's look at the Hebrew words closely. The verse says, "Veha'aretz hayata tohu vabohu." Tohu, tovi, means formlessness, chaos, waste, emptiness. It's used in Isaiah 45:18, where God says he did not create the earth tohu. He did not create it to remain empty, but to be inhabited. Bohu, bov, means void or emptiness. It only appears alongside tohu, as if to intensify the idea. Together, tohu vabohu means utter desolation, unstructured chaos. So the earth at this point isn't a finished creation. It's a chaotic mess waiting for order. Then the verse says, "Vechoshech al pene tehom." Darkness was over the face of the deep. The word tehom, thvam, means the deep waters, the abyss. This is fascinating because in ancient Near Eastern myths, Tehom or similar words like Tiamat in Babylonian myth represented the chaotic sea monster of disorder. But notice what Genesis does. It strips the chaos of any personality. The deep isn't a goddess. It isn't a monster to fight. It's just water, darkness, disorder, and it is fully subject to God. And then the verse ends with hope. Ve'ruach Elohim merashephet al pene hamayim. The Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. The Hebrew word merahepet, means fluttering, hovering, like a bird protecting its nest. Deuteronomy 32:11 uses the same word for an eagle hovering over its young. So here, God's Spirit is not distant. He is close, hovering over the chaos, ready to bring life. Do you see the picture? Genesis 1:2 is not describing a world that's already finished. It's describing the raw materials of a world in chaos, darkness, water, formlessness. And the Spirit of God is there, hovering, preparing to act. This makes perfect sense with the Hebrew reading of verse 1. When God began to create, the earth was tohu vabohu. It's like the opening scene of a movie. Before the story unfolds, we see a dark, empty stage. The Spirit of God is present, the curtain is about to rise, and the first words, "Let there be light," are about to be spoken. Now let's pause and reflect. Why does this matter? Because if you read verse 1, the traditional way, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, then verse 2 becomes a problem. Why is there chaos if God already created everything perfectly? Why is there darkness, waters, disorder? But if you read it the Hebrew way, it's no problem at all. Genesis isn't saying God made everything perfect and then it fell apart. It's saying God began his creative work in the middle of chaos, and his role was to bring order, structure, and meaning. And here's the practical lesson. That's how God always works. He doesn't wait for perfection. He steps into the middle of chaos, whether it's the chaos of the cosmos or the chaos of your life, and begins creating order, light, and life. So verse 2 isn't just background, it's the key. It tells us what creation really is. God bringing order out of chaos and meaning out of emptiness. We've looked at Bereshit and we've seen the chaos of verse 2. Now let's focus on another crucial word in Genesis 1, the Hebrew word bara, bara, usually translated create. In English, when we hear the word create, we immediately think of inventing something brand new out of nothing, like an artist creating a painting on a blank canvas. That idea has been drilled into us. God created the universe out of nothing. But here's the thing. In Hebrew, bara doesn't mean that. So what does it mean? First, let's look at its use in the Hebrew Bible. Bara appears about 50 times, and every single time, the subject is God. Humans never bara. That alone tells us something. It's a divine action. But does it mean material creation? Not always. Let me give you some examples. Psalm 51:10. Create, bara, in me a clean heart, O God. David isn't asking God to invent a new physical organ in his chest. He's asking God to reorder, renew, and purify his inner life. Isaiah 45:7. I form the light and create, bara, darkness. I make peace and create, bara, calamity. Here, bara doesn't mean material creation. It means assigning qualities and functions. Numbers 16:30. But if the Lord creates bara, something new. This refers to God bringing about a new circumstance, not new matter. So in Hebrew thought, bara isn't about pulling something out of nothing. It's about God bringing order, assigning roles, or inaugurating something new into existence. Second, notice the contrast with other Hebrew verbs. Yatsar means to form, like a potter shaping clay. Humans, yatsar. Asa, asha, means to make or do. Humans, asa. But bara? Only God does that. And it's not about shaping matter. It's about establishing purpose and order. This matches perfectly with what we've already seen in Genesis 1. The raw materials, earth, water, darkness, are already there in verse 2. God's role is not to bring them into existence, but to give them structure and function. Think about the pattern of the 6 days of creation. Each day, God doesn't invent matter. He assigns roles. Day 1, He separates light from darkness, time and rhythm. Day 2, He separates waters above from waters below, space and atmosphere. Day 3, He gathers waters and brings out land, habitation. Day 4, He assigns lights to mark days and seasons, purpose. Day 5 and 6, He fills the spaces with living beings, life and order. In other words, creation in Genesis 1 is functional, not material. It's about taking chaos and declaring, this is light, this is darkness, this is land, this is sea. Now, let's address the big question. Doesn't the Bible teach creatio ex nihilo, creation out of nothing? The short answer is, not in Genesis 1. That doctrine developed later, especially in Christian theology under Augustine and others, who read it into the text. But the Hebrew itself doesn't say that. Jewish tradition, by and large, didn't emphasize creation out of nothing. They focused on God's power to bring order out of disorder. The rabbis didn't need God to magically invent matter to prove His greatness. His greatness was in His ability to assign meaning, to tame chaos, to make a world that could sustain life. So why does this matter for us? Because if bara means to assign function and purpose, then Genesis isn't telling us how God made stuff, it's telling us why He made it. Creation isn't about explaining the chemistry of matter, it's about explaining the meaning of existence. That changes everything. It means the Bible isn't in conflict with science because it was never trying to describe physics or atoms. It's describing God's role as the one who gives purpose to all things. So the next time you read Genesis 1 and see the word create, remember, in Hebrew, bara means God is the one who assigns roles, who brings order, who gives purpose. That's the power of creation. To fully appreciate Genesis 1, we have to remember something important. It didn't appear in a vacuum. Israel wasn't living on an island. They were surrounded by nations with their own creation stories. And when the ancient Israelites heard the story of creation, they would have compared it with the myths around them. So let's take a look at a few of those stories. The Babylonians had a famous creation epic called the Enuma Elish. It describes how the god Marduk rose to power. In this story, there were two primeval beings, Apsu, the god of fresh water, and Tiamat, the goddess of salt water. They produced many offspring gods, and eventually a war broke out. Marduk fought and killed Tiamat, the chaos dragon, and split her body in half. One half became the sky, the other half became the land. Out of violence, battle, and bloodshed, the world was formed. This was the worldview Israel's neighbors lived by. Creation comes through divine conflict, and the gods themselves are selfish, violent, and chaotic. The Egyptians had their own story. They believed that in the beginning, there was nothing but watery chaos called Nun. Out of those waters, the first god, Atum or Ra, emerged on a primeval hill. From himself, he brought forth the other gods, who in turn shaped the cosmos. Again, notice the theme, chaos waters at the beginning. But unlike Genesis, creation is tied to the birth and sexual activity of gods. Even closer to Israel's home, the Canaanites had stories about Baal, the storm god, who fought against Yam, the sea god, to establish his rule. Again, violence, rivalry, struggle. When we put Genesis 1 alongside these stories, something fascinating happens. Genesis uses the same imagery, waters, darkness, chaos, but it strips away the polytheism and the violence. There are no rival gods. There are no cosmic battles. The Tehom, the deep, is not a goddess like Tiamat. It's just water. and God rules over it effortlessly. Instead of chaos being defeated in battle, chaos is ordered by the simple power of God's word. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. This is revolutionary. In one stroke, Genesis declares, creation didn't come from violence. It came from speech. The world wasn't born out of accidents or the bodies of dead gods. It was shaped intentionally by one God. Creation isn't the result of chaos winning. It's the result of order imposed by divine wisdom. That's why Genesis mattered so much. It wasn't just telling Israel how the world began. It was teaching them what kind of God they serve. Now you might be thinking, okay, interesting history lesson. But why does this matter for me? Because the message of Genesis is timeless. Ancient people lived in a world of violent gods and arbitrary fate. Genesis says, no. The world is not random. It is not ruled by chaos. It is not sustained by divine rivalries. The world is ordered by one God who speaks meaning into existence, and we still need that truth today. We live in a culture that often tells us the universe is random, meaningless, just the result of cosmic accidents. Genesis answers with the same bold declaration. No, it is God who speaks order into being, and He still speaks today. So Genesis isn't just an ancient story. It's a counter-narrative. It was counter-cultural in the days of Babylon and Egypt, and it's counter-cultural now. The nations said, the gods fight, and that's why we exist. Genesis says, God spoke, and that's why we exist. That's the radical power of this text.